original Quake II, released on December 9th, 1997, was a technical masterpiece for the time. It improved upon the 3D design venture that the original Quake started. The catch was that it was related to the original Quake in name only. Originally titled War, spelled W-O-R, because that was the rad 90s thing to do, Quake II arguably started its streak of technical advancements and achievements that were slapped onto existing IPs. This is obviously just another opinion, but the technical advancement trilogy of Quake II, Quake III Arena, and Doom 3 were built more on the want to advance the capabilities and technology more so than a want to advance those respective franchises. These were all, of course, really good games, but call it what it was. With John Romero and Tom Hall gone, it had started to lose some of its creative edge, but also became more focused on consistent visions for their games. This shows beginning with Quake II compared to the varied level design of Doom 2 and Quake I. At this point, it was all about the technology more than the games or IPs themselves. And then much later on, we also got something similar with id Tech 5 and Rage, but that was at least under a new IP. Even if the game itself didn't feel all that inspired and was again a focus on technology rather than gameplay and a story, all of these games ultimately excelled with their gameplay loop. And Rage even had Fred Flintstone himself, John Goodman.
Here, get in. I know you got questions, but we gotta get moving.
Anyway, Quake II was a 90s Space Marine sci-fi action shooter that improved upon the 3D design concepts that Quake I started with both single player and multiplayer. Quake III was a blazingly fast-paced multiplayer romp that completely owned the love for online multiplayer that the original had. Doom 3 was a sci-fi horror shooter that was unlike anything the gaming world had seen to that point. Divisive among fans as it may be, Doom 3 was beyond excellent at the gameplay loop it eventually settled on, even if that may not have been what some fans wanted at the time. And look, I was like 10 when Doom 3 came out, and I didn't even play Doom 95 for the first time until probably 2004 via this 300 arcade games disc I bought at an Office Depot for $10 because what 10-year-old wouldn't be conned into thinking this was worth their money? And I had no idea what was what when it came to Doom. So I'm not some people nor any people when it comes to what Doom 3 meant at the time. Anyone that was frustrated, annoyed, or disappointed with Doom 3, you eventually got Doom 2016 and Doom Eternal, so you're fine, and everything is fine. It took over a decade, but you're fine now. All that to say, after Quake II, the Quake fandom itself is split into multiple factions. Some view the original as their only true love for the franchise. Some love the Strog series with Quake 2 and 4, and maybe even enemy territory Quake Wars. And some prefer Quake 3 Arena and Quake Champions. Maybe you love a mixture of each, maybe you like Quake 2 but not 4, or vice versa. I've never played Quake 4 yet, so no comment on the latter. But today we are here to talk about Quake 2. But not that Quake 2. We are talking about Raster Productions' Nintendo 64 version of Quake 2. And notice I didn't say port, because much like Doom 64, this was an alternate take on the source material rather than a straight port. Raster Productions was made up of many of the same members that made up the Williams and Midway teams that handled Doom for PS1, Doom 64, and Quake 64. And even Ken Razor Richmond is back? Wait. Oh, it's Aubrey Hodges! I'm not sure why I used a pseudonym here, because he did a great job as always. Released in June of '99, Quake II for N64 was fairly late to the party. It was released a year and a half after the original PC version in December of '97, but it did beat the PS1 port to shelves by about 3 months. Quake II was kind of the somewhat unknown and therefore underappreciated game overall that is sandwiched between the early greats like GoldenEye and Turok 2 preceding it, but then it had Turok 3 and Perfect Dark released soon after. Much like Doom 64, I think the naming convention here is a disservice to the game. People mistook Doom 64 as a port because of the name. Then people were disappointed that Quake 64 was a port. And here we have Quake 2, which is not a port and instead a set of mostly original levels using the same enemies, weapons, and overall similar visual aesthetic to that of Quake 2 for the PC. I think this is especially important to point out because Quake 2 for PS1 was a port and released within the same name. So Quake 2 for the N64 didn't really do itself any favors not having at least a subtitle at the end of the name to set itself apart. So that being said, it was of course on the N64 and PC had far surpassed consoles at this point. So you can argue that nobody that had played it on PC already would have ever had any intention of also dropping money on an inferior N64 version. While I couldn't find any catalog or article confirming, I would assume this game launched at either $40 or $50 back in the day, and that's $40 or $50 in 1999 money, kids, not 2022 money. That equates to anywhere from $70 to about $90 in today's money. The story is similar to the PC version, but then it's not? Question mark? The instruction manual implies it's a one-man show this time versus the fleet of Marines getting dropped on Stragos like in the opening cinematic of Quake II. And here you have a linear progression of levels versus the open hub concept of the PC. You have your choice between a few palette swaps of the same generic-looking Space Marine because Space Marines were rad and so were the 90s. I personally always go with the blue fella, but I can't tell you why. You'll only ever see your character from the third person at the end of each level, so that's about all that matters. Much like the preceding id entries by this development team, the game makes great use of colored lighting. Here it is a lot more vibrant with intentional bright blues, greens, and such kind of like what you saw in the early levels of Doom 64, just not as dark and dreary. And then of course much brighter, vibrant, and varied than the Godfather 2 yellow and brown palette of Quake 64, and kinda even the PC version of Quake II at certain points. This game really is brighter, or at least more vibrant in general. It does have its occasional dark corners and hallways and has tremendous shadow effects. And this might sound crazy, but this game even has dynamic lighting in firefights. So let's actually play the game, shall we? But let me tell you, here is where things take a deep, dark turn. See, about 2 months ago when I was working on the next N64 Showdown video, I thought my expansion pack crapped out on me. I couldn't get Madden 64 to display it all when I was attempting to capture an OBS. And now why would anyone intentionally want to play Madden 64, you ask? You know, the one that doesn't actually have the NFL license and none of the official teams? Yeah, I don't know either, but that's for another day. Anywho, so I try a few more games, including a few games that outright require it, like DK64 or Majora's Mask, and no dice. My expansion pack was off-brand and was of course over 20 years old, so I was totally bought into the possibility that it was broken. So I take out the 4 megabytes of life-changing RAM and put in the old jumper pack. And wouldn't you know it, my N64 came back to life and was showing up in OBS just fine. So a few weeks later, it was Quake II's turn. I played this on normal and got about halfway through. I was having some serious troubles because this game is just running so slow. I played this more than a few times back in the day, and I didn't remember it running this slow. We're talking an average of 20 frames per second and even 15 or less when the action picks up. The enemies look like a freaking slideshow and worse than Quake 64. It's almost like playing an old COD game with a bad connection. I swear I even had the Ethernet disconnect symbol show up on my screen at one point. I just couldn't do it anymore, so I grabbed my assumedly broken expansion pack, blew into it like the back labels always told you not to, and fired up my 64. Still nothing. But I got the bright idea to try this on an actual TV instead of my laptop. See, I have a cheap HDMI adapter, but it's never wronged me on a real TV, but has on occasion on either of my PCs. And wouldn't you know it, we were moving at a brisk pace of 30 to 40 frames per second during gameplay, and it can even hit 60 frames if the game was hardly anything to render. No, seriously, stare at a wall in a hallway, and your N64 will suddenly be putting out 60 FPS. It's incredible. Now, F-Zero X is the only N64 game I can think of that puts out 60 at almost all times, but every once in a while there is a game that can surprise you by going above and beyond like this. But it's usually only during cutscenes and not actual gameplay render. And that just goes to show how much the Williams Midway Raster team have learned since Quake 64, and how well put together this game is with the expansion pack in use. So I got the console hooked back up to my laptop and realized the default resolution for the capture device had suddenly changed and wasn't jiving with my OBS settings. Can't tell you why it changed, but it could have something to do with me probably leaving my laptop unattended in the presence of a 1-year-old and a 4-year-old. But at the end of the day, it was like playing a completely different game. Like my N64 had suddenly grown up to be a world-class athlete. This game basically has 3 different possibilities, and they can all vastly affect the gameplay and that kind of an impression the game leaves on you. If you play without the expansion pack, it's a game that has aged terribly and is borderline unplayable at times. Like 4-player Rage Wars with rocket launchers unplayable. And it ends up looking like an overly ambitious N64 shooter that bit off more than the N64 could fit in its mouth, let alone chew. Then if you have the expansion pack, it's almost the same level of visual performance with Perfect Dark and Turok 3. There are high quality textures everywhere you look, the enemies look pretty appreciable, and obviously they aren't as detailed as the PC original, but they are much improved from the enemy models in Quake 64. This game uses the same style of colored lighting you see in their previous games, and this is also where you can appreciate some of that real-time lighting that I mentioned. So those are two options, and they are vastly different experiences. The third option is playing via emulator, and I don't even mean that just for the sake of trying to play a console FPS with mouse look enabled. Even if you are just playing with an N64 controller, it's still worth it. The game runs consistently at 60 FPS and just looks incredible. When it comes to emulating, some games can look kind of awkward and uncanny because the textures were never really meant to have an added layer of visual fidelity to them, and it just gives the game a weird feeling of trying really hard to look good but lacking the actual sophistication to justify the quality of the textures. Quake II for N64 isn't that game. It looks incredible on emulation, and while it might be a sin to some, I would argue it's the definitive way to experience the game. But, saying all that and advocating for emulation does kind of take away from what the team at Raster were able to pull off on the real N64 hardware. Because as much of a tale of two games as it is with the expansion pack situation, the game really is one of the top 20 or maybe even top 15 best looking games out of the entire library. And it's potentially the third best looking out of the FPS games behind Perfect Dark and Turok 3. And I put it ahead of Turok 2 and Armorine solely based on the frame rate not taking a huge dump anytime you pull the trigger, and due to the lack of fog. When you boot it up, they are trying to give you the Doom 64 treatment here, with a small army of Strogg throwing everything they've got at you while the camera pans across the Quake II logo. Now, having this game at the ripe old age of 10 or so, the sounds of the Iron Maidens here often had my mom charging up the stairs to see what could possibly be on my TV to make that sort of sound. And to prove to her what it was, I would have to restart the level and find that same maiden, or restart the game to show her the opening video, and that could have resulted in lost progress with no quick saves. Good times. Level 1 is the Strogg Outpost. We are playing on hard here for as much as I can stand it without flinging the console out the front door. But be warned that around level 7, this game completely stops messing around. And I want to note that I did finish the game on hard. There are really only a handful of levels that put a bag over your head and beat you in the next week, but this game means business when it wants to. The first level opens up somewhat similar to the PC version, but you don't get any sort of opening cutscene or even a text crawl. It just drops you right into the action. There is some creativity to the environment right off the bat, with some explosions going on, and you have to bust through the wall to get into the Strogg base. This level consists strictly of grunt enemies, and one of those being the hit scanner variety. These can be a pain when they are on the move, as they are some of the smallest enemies, but the enemies with the plasma pistols can be dodged easily enough. You get the shotgun immediately, but I choose not to use it during the first level for the most part, because ammo can be sparse in some of the later levels in the game. And while the plasma pistol in this game is about as useless as the axe in Quake I, it's serviceable to save ammo in the right situations. And about this shotgun, it's not bad by any means because it does have a nice spread, but that spread is also what kind of sets it back. It's just fine, and it's really only useful for two enemies in my opinion. Those being the guards and the flyers. And it's mostly because I want to avoid wasting ammo with the super shotgun on either of those as much as I can. This level has some decent uses of verticality to add flavor. Nothing like the PC version's first level, of course, but it definitely could have been more boring and does a nice job of laying out a template of what you can expect to be built off of. If you put out enough effort, you can get the super shotgun in this level via the secret near the end of the level, which brings up a good point of occasional destructible environments. Again, nothing earth-shattering, but they clearly put out the effort to incorporate it. And that's kind of what this game is. Consistent effort. Consistent effort from a team that took a lot of flack for just making a simple port in Quake 64 compared to what they had done previously for Doom for PS1 and Doom 64. The visual aesthetic of the first level is a really good template for what you can expect from most of the game. Combinations of colored lighting and shadows that contrast nicely against the skyboxes and pushes the N64 near its limit, which again, even without emulation, looks absolutely incredible for the time and is held up well enough. The second level immediately ratchets up the difficulty. We move on from the plasma pistol and shotgun hit scanning guards to machine gun hit scanning guards. Then we have enforcers. Enforcers are kind of the bulkiest version of fodder this game has to offer, and their attack winds up giving you so much of a heads up that you should never really be in danger against one or two of them. And due to their size, they are much easier to hit than the guards. In my book, the enforcers are second to the machine gun guard. The guards don't give you much warning before depleting 25% of your health, and their potential last stand attacks can put you on a stretcher if you aren't careful. Then you have the gunner. This is Quake II's equivalent of an ogre. The gunner has a grenade launcher where it will shoot out multiple at a time compared to the ogre just firing one. It also has a machine gun attack that, while somewhat easy to dodge in the same context as the enforcer if you have room, can do a number on you if you aren't careful. They also have a melee attack if you get up too close and personal. But the catch is the easiest way to down these suckers is getting point blank with the super shotgun for 2 rounds. Combat loop in this game turns into a war of attrition soon enough. Using the D-pad, the movement can be jerky enough that you can miss fairly often, and your best bet sometimes is just get right up in their face and unload with the super shotgun, at least with some of the earlier enemies. But to help alleviate that, I'd recommend disabling the always run option. You may get acclimated enough that you can handle it being on at all times, but there are very few jumps in the game where running is actually required, so it's not much of a hassle to turn it off. After a few of those close encounters, you may notice something really weird about this game's combat. No matter which weapon you are using, your shots are ever so slightly to the right of the crosshair. So you are best served compensating for this when you're aiming, especially with the super shotgun and the launchers. Overall, this does a nice job of adding verticality to the level design with rooms that loop back in on each other with a second story as well as another instance of a destructible environment that's actually necessary to progress through the level. This level introduces you to and much like the Enforcer, as long as you have some space to move around in and there aren't more than 2, you'll have a pretty easy time with. But the first room of this level can play games with you depending on how smart the AI wants to be. It's a multi-level room that loops around on itself, so if you poke your head far enough out that the sees you, you could very well be facing one head-on and have one going around the room behind you if you don't deal with the first fast enough. Your pathfinding just basically zigzags until they get right in your face for a melee attack, which as long as you haven't backed yourself into a corner, you should be able to evade before it attacks since it never runs and attacks simultaneously. But with the layout of the room, they often get hung up on the corners near the ramps, and the enforcers on the lower level do the same. They just huddle up in the corner and run against the wall instead of going around and up the ramp. It also introduces you to the tank enemy. But these things are so slow that you can just pop around the corner, launch a grenade, or fire a rocket, or a railgun, and rinse and repeat before they even fire a shot. A couple of highlights from this level are one segment where you go down an elevator shaft into a pretty tight hallway that has a gunner and a in it. But if you try to march down the hallway head on, you're quickly going to be surrounded by 2 enforcers that spawn from a trap at the beginning of the hallway, and 2 more that come from the side rooms at the end. So your best hope is the gunner and the trespassers start infighting before you get too far. Or you could hop right back on the elevator and try to get one of them to follow you up. After you have taken those 2 out, you could slow play your way down the hallway until the trap with the 2 enforcers opens up, and you can have a grenade waiting for you. And that's honestly a lot of what this game boils down to. Play a level for the first time, get wrecked by a trap or a spawn closet, identify when and or where the trap is triggered, methodically trigger said trap, rinse and repeat. Without any quick saves and some of the later levels taking ages to get through, I can see why this may not have been everyone's cup of tea back in the day. But outside of the PC world, pretty much all games consistently had some aspect of this type of trial and error back in the day. The last highlight is when you pick up the data disk in one of the final rooms, the game 6-3 on you. It's a good old-fashioned game of circle strafing, but there's just enough odd level geometry in the room that you can get yourself trapped and stuck if you aren't careful. Next up is level 4, the Communications Center. This map is nothing special and it's just a lot of straightforward combat. You poke your head out of the doorway, see what enemy alert sounds you hear, duck your head back in, and wait for them to show their ugly face. This level does, however, introduce you to the parasite. If you can keep your distance, they can be harmless, but that kind of goes against the nature of the situations where the devs place them. They are almost sure to be right in your lap each time they are involved in the action. The exception is in this multi-level room where you do have one tucked away in a corner on the first floor, but you also have one upstairs with a gunner. And if the gunner's grenades bounce just right, you can get them to infight pretty quickly. It also introduces the flyers. These almost always come in sets of 2 or 3, and they can drain you pretty quickly if you don't have a corner to hide behind. They aren't the brightest enemies, but their dual plasma shots can really do a number on you if you let them get the jump on you. They are projectile-based, but it's a much faster projectile than any of the other enemies so far, so dodging can be difficult if you have more than one firing at once. Level 5 Orbital Defense is full of flyers and Iron Maidens. These rocket-launching ladies of the night aren't too big of a hassle if you can hand them down before they start unleashing their consecutive volleys of rockets. They have a pretty straightforward and forgiving wind-up, but if you don't strike first, you can end up wasting some ammo while having to dodge their rockets. They are pretty slow and overall only dangerous in numbers. This level is one I remember pretty well when I come back to the game, and that's probably because I die a fair bit on it. You get simultaneous doses of flyers, with a few of those being placed in areas you've already cleared out and are walking back through. And even with a few trespassers in a room with an instant death pit, so this level is one that epitomizes the combat loop of popping your head out of a hallway or corner, waiting for the enemy alert sounds, backing up and waiting so you can unload on them with the super shotgun. And this level is all about memorizing enemy placements. There is a cool set piece with the hangar, and that room has a great combat scenario with the low gravity mixed with the tank and the Iron Maidens high above you on a catwalk. Using the grenade launcher in low gravity makes this a fun scenario. There are a couple more sets of flyers and trespassers, but you're pretty much in the clear if you survive the initial battle in the hangar. The next level, Docking Station, is a test of how much ammo you've managed to preserve to this point. You get 2 new enemies with the Icarus and the Gladiator. The Icarus is basically a tankier version of the Flyers, but also larger. They have the same attack, a quicker windup, and almost 5 times the health. These things are absolute pains and they should be feared, but for the wrong reasons. They are easier to hit than the Flyers due to their size, but they just take way too much damage to not be considered cheap in my book. Now the Gladiators, these guys have railguns that can one-shot you if your health is low enough, especially on hard. But the trick is to get close enough to bait them into running through their melee attack, which is a twofer, and therefore takes longer than most other enemies. So if you can successfully get close enough without taking a railgun blast, you can unload on them with, you guessed it, the super shotgun, and make pretty quick work of them. There are a few in this level, and they are all in close quarter situations, so you're unlikely to have to deal with the railgun here, but in later levels and even the next one, these guys are set up for sniping opportunities. This level will have you mowing through enemies and ammo, and while it's the right kind of challenging to have a level that focuses on combat so much, it's important that you be as intentional as possible with what weapon you're using and not wasting ammo. And that means avoiding combat in the final room. It is a death trap that, while having good potential for infighting, will absolutely leave you in a tight spot for the next map. Because in my opinion, level 7 and 8 where you sneak onto a Strogg ship are where the game really takes you for prisoner on anything above easy difficulty. Having grenade and rocket launcher ammo stored up for this map is a must. As soon as you open the first set of doors, you have a gunner right in front of you, 1 up top, and 2 hit scanning so-and-sos up to your top left and right. Your best bet is to use your rockets here. 1 rocket will stun the first gunner, then you immediately hit it with the second. Then you can use your rockets to make quick work of the 2 guards. The second gunner can be a problem depending on where he is standing by the time you've taken care of his friends, so you can either use rockets again or get up close with the super shotgun if you have time. Then at the opposite end of the room you have 2 more hit scanners waiting for you. That may not be your best option if you only have a few left. This room also has a secret where you can get the hyper blaster. Immediately at the end of the room there is an elevator that, while it isn't necessarily a trap, it can feel like one if you try to take it head on. So again, spamming the grenades up there, praying you hit something. This level gives you a branching path, but ultimately has a locked door that sends you down a specific path. Said path has not one but two of the gladiators, and they are a fair enough distance that they might get a railgun shot off before you get close to them. Here's where the launcher ammo preservation comes into play again. The first gladiator can be dealt with up close more likely than not, but the second story in the same room has a gunner and a gladiator up top. So your best bet is spamming your grenade launcher up there again, and if you're feeling lucky, you can sneak up there and try to trigger some infighting. This level gives you the railgun you've been dodging as of late, but of course it pits you against a gladiator in a long, narrow hallway before you can grab it. If you've gotten this far, you're pretty much home free, but I just have so much trouble with the first half of this level usually. On my normal playthrough, I probably had to retry this map upwards of 20 times, but wouldn't you know it, on hard, I got it on the first try. No, just kidding, I died at least 10 times and even almost botched the winning run by rocketing myself against the wall in the next to last room. Another thing to mention on this level is, if you're playing without the expansion pack, this and the next are just straight up unplayable. There are so many enemies on screen at once in some of the rooms that you can be fighting near 10 frames per second, and this game is hard enough when it's running well. Next up is the cargo bay of the same ship we infiltrated. I personally enjoy this map. It has some pretty unique combat setups out of the entire game, and I think it's a pretty neat layout that completely loops back around on itself, but does have a couple of cheap shots with either really cramped combat or hit scanners from far off. This game does have a couple of really helpful power-up segments that give you a much-needed power trip as long as you're efficient with them. You get an invisibility power-up in a segment that has several gunners and guards all at once, so you can unload on them with either the Hyper Blaster or Chain Gun. The next secret is one of the very few quad damages in the entire game. Getting this is fairly important as you're about to go get 2 flyers and 3 gunners within a short period of time, so being able to mow them down and not limp into the final battle is important. The last room has 2 gunners and a gladiator, so explode them or let them explode each other, or if you're lucky you can thread the needle and get to the exit without wasting ammo or getting too roughed up. If this game had not already set itself apart from the original, I think Level 9 is one of its most unique maps. You go from slightly above average space environments to a mine, and it briefly introduces a new enemy with the mutants. Now the PC original version of course had both of these, but it was a generic and drab palette of browns and that was about it. This map sets itself apart with a more interesting palettes of grays, and the layout of the level is good stuff. Now the mutants aren't the best looking enemies in the game due to their limited frames of animation making them look choppier than most, but they are a nice melee only change up with all of the we have fought in the last few levels. They are so big that they take up most of the screen when you're close, and the super shotgun is the only medicine to remedy that issue. You start high up on a ledge with enemies below, enforcers, parasites, and mutants, so spamming grenades down below is your best option. And the devs agree with me because they give you a launcher and ammo if you've managed not to find one yet at this point in the game. The environment is of course different than any other in the game, and it has kind of an icy, slippery ground you walk on that causes you to have to compensate for your movements in combat. This level is a circle that loops back around on itself, but does so with making you also take care of some of the things on the second story. You could take out the enemies on these catwalks on each path before you even get up there, or you could just take one path and clear out both floors, but either way you won't have to deal with everyone eventually. And I think the varied options in the slick floor add some flavor after the tight corridors of the past 2 levels. Oh, and there's a few death pits when fighting a as well. Next up is the storage facility. This map is full of guards, and the name of the game is to keep moving and shooting so you can avoid the hit scans as much as possible. And that makes this one of the more fast-paced levels in the game, so your best friend is probably the machine gun here, so you keep spraying and praying. Yet another level that loops back in on itself as you prepare this laser grid of sorts, but the real differentiating factor here are 2 things. You get a mini-boss battle, and you get the BFG 10,000 through a fairly straightforward secret. The mini-boss is a super tank, and if you get the BFG, it's a breeze. It's not too incredibly difficult without it if you have a railgun or hyper blaster ammo. The real threat is actually the battlefield itself, as the laser grid you turn on will one-shot you. So if you let the tank cover too much ground, you won't really have anywhere to go and can look forward to starting level over. Organic storage is definitely one of my least favorite levels in the whole game, but I won't say it's necessarily for the right reasons. Once you put gunners and parasites in the same room again, It's nothing but frustrating while you try to keep your distance from the parasites, but also leave yourself open to getting hit scanned by the gunners. This level has a lot of gunners and guards in tight spaces, and while that's easy to use the super shotgun on them, they probably get the drop on you first in most rooms. So this level really comes back to the tried and true formula of dying over and over while memorizing more and more enemy placement with each death. And I say it could be a major turnoff if you weren't really loving the game to this point anyway. The processing center is a really frustrating level, but I think it's almost an acceptable kind of frustrating. The difficulty of this game spikes around levels 7 and 8, then it comes back down until this level and the next. Here you have some of almost every single enemy type you have encountered in the game thus far. You'll be fighting Iron Maidens, Gladiators, and Flyers at the same time. Or Maidens, Enforcers, and Flyers. Or Parasites, Gladiators, and Maidens. It's just a lot of varied combat scenarios that keep the combat interesting and serve a challenge that feels satisfying when you finally persevere through this gauntlet of 60 enemies. But I have to gripe about the high volume of Parasites and Flyers. These are my two least favorite enemies in the game, and there are plenty here. And much like the Strog Freighter, or at least leading up to it, resource management is a must here. This level hardly gives you any ammo, so you will be depleting multiple ammo types completely. And it really got me thinking of how much more difficult this game could be if you don't find many secrets, which I didn't along the way. And while of course secrets have weapons and ammo as part of their nature of their existence, it's just incredible how much ammo you're missing out on over the course of the entire game if you don't find secrets consistently. But the next map generously refills a couple of weapons for you at the beginning. The geothermal station is another level that sets itself apart. But that doesn't mean it doesn't also piss me off. This map is crawling with Flyers and Gladiators, and they all show up at the most inconvenient times possible. Take the opening tram ride. Before you get on, you have to take out 3 Flyers that are all spaced pretty far apart, so you're more than likely going to waste some ammo on them. Then you have a Gladiator waiting for you at the end, so he's of course trying to snipe you with the railgun for at least half the ride. You can cheese him if you can spot him from the end of the platform with the railgun just enough, or maybe the rocket launcher, but if you don't have ammo for either, you're kind of out of luck at this point, and you just have to jump around on the tram ride hoping that you make it to the end. This map also has 2 platforming sections. One is as easy as it is frustrating. There's a paddle that slowly moves around the lava pit, and you have to jump onto the paddle and then back off of it on the other side. Now in theory it sounds easy, but that jerky D-pad movement I mentioned earlier in the video can lead you to an untimely demise. Keeping in mind that there are no quick saves in this life. So a half step too far and you have to start all over. And then before that there is kind of a piston and cogs section where you have to jump from one to the other. And if you're feeling insane you can go for a secret in the room and grab some extra armor on the other side. But the amount of falls you take getting there will take just as much health from you as you would gain if you eventually made it to the armor. I'm not a fan of first-person platforming games like this and Turok in general. I mean, once you had Thief, the Dark Project, everyone thought it was necessary to include at least a few sections like these in their first-person game. And well, it just isn't necessary or impressive in most cases. Then almost at the end of the level, you'll be coming across multiple gladiators, and they pull a fast one on you here. Coming out of this cavern, you aggro a gladiator. So you make like a tree and get out, so you can wait for him. But out of your view and out of your earshot, there is another gladiator that just spawned that'll be waiting for you in that same hallway after you take out the first. It's pretty cool to do this at the end of the level when you've already dodged so many of these guys along the way. Overall, this level is a change of pace, but it has too many frustrating combat scenarios and platforming for me to say I outright like it. Because I don't. The detention center is a rehash of the level of the same name from the PC version. It of course uses the same template of soldiers moaning, crying, and begging to be put out of their misery while being held in a cell or just before dying a terrible death. This level really does include some varied scenery compared to just about any level in the rest of the game. One of the highlights of this level is a section where you're dodging a crushing machine, kind of like a conveyor belt scenario. You have spikes come from the walls, and then when you get to the end, a glass floor breaks out from under you. You have to jump quickly from one side to the other before the remaining shards will fall out from under you, and you have to start all over. It's a really nice touch, but you'll most likely die a few times if it's your first time playing the game. There are a few more environmental traps and scenic views throughout, and the enemy placement can be pretty cramped at times. So this will probably take you a few tries, even if it's not your first playthrough. The research lab has nearly nothing of significance to note. This level once again epitomizes the game's combat loop of sticking your head out the end of the hallway, waiting for the sound of what enemy type you alerted, then waiting for them to get a sample of the super shotgun. This level does have multiple instances of handgunners in tight quarters, so you may have multiple attempts to look forward to. Level 16 might have the worst start to any level in this game. So you're getting off of this train car and you're met by and an enforcer. But the enforcer is going to hit an alarm that releases 3 flyers. Then the next room has no less than 3 and 2 enforcers in it as well. But once you pass the threshold of the second room exit, you meet 2 flyers and a gladiator, but then a trap wall lowers and lets out 2 more and an enforcer behind you. It's absolutely absurd. Your best option here is to run past everyone and head for this underwater tunnel while everyone hopefully infights behind you and saves you some ammo. But you will be met with 3 more flyers on the other side. So, if you do make it through, it's not all sunshine and roses. I honestly remember this level the least out of all on any given playthrough, and with how hard it is, I find that kind of weird. But it probably means that the hate for this level is so strong that I just try my hardest to forget it and not let it ruin the game for me. But that brings us to the access conduits. This level has a really nice opening gimmick with this long hallway where you ride an elevator to the other side where you start the long journey as the level loops back in on itself multiple times. This level keeps up the aesthetic of the previous, and both of them serve as a nice change of pace after levels 14 and 15 dragging on for less than stellar time due to the inevitable deaths and retries. I'm just kidding. This is hands down the worst level in the game. Especially if your ammo is pretty low all around like mine was. It's possible to cheese plenty of it, but you're still going to die in the process. A lot. There are 49 enemies in this level that is mostly comprised of gunners, flyers, parasites, and Icarus. And those are all probably the least likable enemies in the game. The first segment of this level gets the blood boiling. You are greeted by 2 flyers on the other side of the door. Then after you turn on the floating platform, you get spotted by 2 Icarus, a gunner, and after the platform moves about halfway down the hallway, 2 more flyers. The catch is you have little to no room to dodge, and if you fall off... Oh no! It's boiling acid! If you survive that, there is a gunner and a parasite waiting for you at the end, and you have very little room to work with. So you won't be out of reach of the parasite's attack, and you have no chance if the gunner fires a bunch of grenades. Now, like I said, you can cheese this. Before you push the button to activate the floating platform, you can poke your head around the corner and use the railgun on the gunner. Then after you push the button, you can rinse and repeat because this spawns the 2 Icarus, but you don't necessarily have to be on the platform for them to spawn. After you take care of them, finally hop on the platform and take out the flyers waiting for you above. If you get them fast enough, you have time to launch some grenades over the other side of the room to get a head start on the gunner and the parasite. And while this isn't necessarily bad level design, I mean it is truly challenging, it just kind of epitomizes that frustrating combat loop of just finding where the enemies are so that you remember for next time. It's not necessarily a true challenge in some ways. Next, there is a spiral staircase with 2 flyers waiting for you. The catch is, halfway up the staircase, 2 gunners, 2 parasites, and 2 flyers spawn in on the next floor, and you can even hear it happen. This is a massacre waiting to happen, and if you make it to the top of the stairs, an Icarus spawns out of a trap behind you. So, what you can do is go far enough up the stairs to take out the 2 flyers, but go back down and cheese the first gunner with rockets, grenades, or the railgun. But keep in mind, if he doesn't want to fight you from up top, he will just come down those stairs right after you. And the tight hallway and downward slope really give their grenades some distance in getting to you, so you'll be dead on the spot if you don't get him up top. Your best bet is to charge upstairs with the super shotgun. After that, you can go back downstairs and launch some grenades to take out at least one of the parasites depending on your distance. because for whatever reason they can't make it through that same doorway at the top more often than not. At that point, you can probably just go upstairs with the chain gun and handle the remaining parasite, gunner, and flyers on the far side of the room. But down the very next hallway is yet another parasite, and it's a parasite that can't be cheesed with grenades because he doesn't spawn until you round the corner. So the trick is to launch a grenade, immediately go around the corner so the parasite spawns shortly or just as the grenade explodes. Then there's a flyer with him too. At the end of that hall is another gunner and 2 more flyers. Then after you hit a switch, there's 2 more parasites and 2 more flyers. So you'll probably die here on your first attempt. Then you'll know you have your rocket launcher ready at the next time. Heck, the devs give you a rocket launcher right before turning the switch, so it was meant to be. After you exit said room, there will be 2 more Icarus and 2 more flyers waiting for you at the end. At this point, use whatever ammo you have, if you have any. If you watch my playthrough on the Better Horizons Plays channel, you'll see just how little ammo I had left for anything at this point. I was trying to snipe flyers with my pistol for half this level, and it felt pretty hopeless at times. You have now drained the acid trap, and there is a door down here, but it has 2 more gunners and a parasite inside. You could throw some grenades in there to get the gunners' attention and take them out, but much like the parasite upstairs around the corner, this one doesn't spawn, or at least I can't get it to be aggroed until it's in your line of sight. So you have at least a snowball's chance of peeking around the corner and nailing it with the railgun. Take the elevator up, and it's another parasite. These 2 consecutive enemies are another scenario where you will likely die on at least your first couple of attempts. Anyway, this has opened 2 doors that were previously locked on the 2nd floor. You exit through one of said doors, and there is a gunner and an Icarus waiting for you on the other side of the door. Imagine that. So again, whatever ammo you have left, smoke them if you got them. You could try to bait the gunner into chasing you through the elevator and getting himself crushed, but it only happened for me 1 time out of the 15 or so that I failed this mission. Now the second door that was previously unreachable has a parasite and a gunner on the other side. This is yet another pivotal moment where you will probably die a horrible death on your first attempt reaching this far. But this was one of the easier encounters. It's there, it's a tight hallway where they can't escape any of the splash damage whatsoever if you use an explosive weapon. Round the corner for another gunner, or send a grenade around the corner first. This next room is a real treat though. A gunner, a parasite, 3 flyers, and 2 Icarus. There will undoubtedly be some infighting here that will do some of the work for you, and the abysmal enemy pathfinding keeps the parasite and or gunner from getting to you. But the flyers and Icarus are a pain until you take out the parasite and the gunner, because they significantly hamper your ability to move around and dodge the flying enemy's attacks. There is a BFG on the other side of the room with the gunner, and it's kind of a trap. Grabbing this, or killing the gunner, whichever happens first, will spawn 2 tanks and a gladiator. The gladiator will be able to see you almost anywhere you go on the top level, so he has to be priority number 1. The problem is you can easily get picked off by one of the tanks if you take too long choosing your shot on the gladiator. So I just say use the BFG ammo on him to be safe so you can keep out of sight of the tanks. Ammo is again pretty scarce at this point, so your best bet is using a railgun to try to line the tanks up and hit them simultaneously. You can even jump down there with them, but the splash damage from their rockets is so big that you probably won't last long. I died in this room, aka at the very end of the level with the last 2 enemies, no less than 3 times. At one point, I even accidentally fell down there with them while I had my blaster equipped and barely made it back up. After weighing my options, or lack thereof, I used up my BFG ammo on them, and in hindsight, it's kind of whatever because the last level gives you so much ammo prior to the boss fight that it doesn't even matter. This level can induce John McEnroe levels of rage if you don't have memorized each and every enemy placement with each death. And that's a shame this far into the game. But I get that the devs probably had this grand idea of a non-secret, extremely difficult level later on in the game, and I will say I'm glad they didn't make that choice until this late in the game, even if there are a couple of difficulty spikes. Now, Descent to the Core is one of the coolest portions of this entire game. but on your first playthrough, it can also be the hardest. The effect that they pulled off with the scrolling wall textures looks excellent. It really does make it look like you're in the middle of a giant machine that is keeping the planet and the enemy up and running. And when you mix that with the color palette, it really is an immersive experience. It gives a great atmosphere and it really does make you feel like you're near the end. But like I said, it can also be one of the, if not the hardest level in the whole game. There is a chance for a cheap, accidental death in almost every single room due to all the platforming. But it's such a short level that I don't think you can hold it against it. And it really is the same kind of risk over and over, either jumping too soon and falling into a pit or staying on too long and getting crushed on the way up. So you kind of know what to expect after even the very first platforming segment, just maybe not exactly where to expect it each time. Another nice touch is the level of darkness here. It is intentional and unforgiving. In some of the bigger rooms where the darkness reigns supreme, you will spend as much time trying to find where you're getting shot at from as you will actually progressing through the level in general. I think it's a really nice touch that does a great job of putting off an atmosphere that puts into perspective just how far you're going to get to the final bosses. And the sight of a trespasser charging at you out of the darkness is pretty jarring the first time it happens. This whole level kind of reminds me of the fan blade sequences of Gaul Space Force on Shadows of the Empire, except it doesn't constantly piss me off. If you know what you're doing, though, this map can be completed in probably 3 or 4 minutes, which is saying a lot when a quote-unquote easy level to this point has been a little under 10 minutes. But I've just never been that confident in the platforming to be able to blaze through it like that, and this level is pretty forgiving with the number of health and ammo pickups you get. It doesn't send you limping into the final level. At the end of the level, you catch a look at the final boss, or one of them, and it's just a reskinned tank with a higher health count. The tank commander from the original PC version was just a standard enemy, albeit a rare one. It has the same attacks as a regular tank and just a much higher health count. The command core is where the final showdown happens. It's a nice looking, much brighter environment compared to most of the game, and it really gives off a much cleaner techno vibe compared to most of the Strogg environments. In typical FPS fashion, you get loaded up on resources prior to the battle. You have to take on 2 tank commanders at once, and it's a big enough room that you can finally do some well-deserved circle strafing here. These guys are so slow, and if you've saved enough energy ammo, you can make quick work of them using the BFG. But the catch is there are 2 battles here, so if you spend all your BFG ammo on 2 of these slowpokes, you'll have a tougher time with the 2 Flying Guardian bosses. My recommendation is rockets and chain gun on the tanks, or the railgun if you have enough slugs, but it fires slowly enough that a miss can set you behind since you'll be moving around for the whole battle. But these guys are big enough that you're bound to hit at least one of them with any weapon at all. The 2 Guardians are faster than the tanks, but not fast enough for it to matter. Pretty much just the exact same strategy applies here. I just don't know how to feel about the final battles. Quake II is a hard enough game that I think you've managed to get this far. You deserve a good old-fashioned circle strafing showdown with an ammo surplus, and the default controller layout really complements this. And if you aren't familiar with the default controller layout for Quake II, just listen to my thoughts on controller layouts for Doom 64 and Quake 64, and they actually nail it with the default layout here in my opinion. But after all the efforts the devs put into crafting their own levels for this version of Quake II, I think it's a shame they couldn't put together a unique final boss, or at least a boss battle that had any sort of twist to it. Speaking of twists, there is one secret map. It's a simple yet challenging rockets-only gauntlet of gladiators and 2 of the Flying Guardians you just faced. It's nothing special, but the short part time is a fun challenge as there is no point A to B. It's just simply, how quickly can you clean house? Completing this will net you the same map in multiplayer, and with rockets, it can be a pretty fun time. The multiplayer is nothing to write home about, but it can work in the right context. When you have 4 players, the visual fidelity takes a bigger hit than a WWE star. It kind of lives in this uncanny in between 32 and 64-bit graphics that does not impress. But most N64 FPS games take a hit in multiplayer, let alone with 4 players. And by all means it plays better than Quake 64's multiplayer. But I wish they could have gotten more out of it visually. I think it's fun with the explosives and maybe the automatic weapons, but outside of that, I can't see it being enjoyable since it's just so hard to land any direct hits with the choppy frame rate. It's a game that you could absolutely not just pick up and play with anybody like you can GoldenEye. But I think it can make for a fun experience if you have a group that likes Quake II or Quake multiplayer in general. And again, that's really only in the context of what fun you can make out of it with probably more so the explosive weapons, because there won't be many direct hit railgun frags like the PC multiplayer is so famous for. I've praised the visuals pretty thoroughly here, but there is one area of the game I have a pretty consistent dislike of. Those are the weapon visuals and honestly the shooting overall. Not the combat, but the actual shooting. I know that sounds a little too aggressive, but this game really does not function very well in the shooting area. And that's not good for an FPS. I mentioned earlier that all of your shots are slightly offset to the right, and that's fine once you permanently remember to account for it, but should you have to? If I have a crosshair, I expect the crosshair to represent where my shots will land, not 3 pixels to the right of said crosshair. With Quake II, we graduated from the original Doom perspective of the weapon being in the center of the screen, so I understand the sort of realism they were going for here, but that doesn't mean I have to like it. The only way I can complement this, though, is you can consistently fire your explosive weapons around corners without the risk of offing yourself. This was a huge gripe I had with Doom 64 and even Quake 64, but to a lesser extent. I would feel like I was well clear of a corner when firing the rocket launcher, and I would end up blowing myself up on a corner that was barely even outside of my FOV. The other aspects of the shooting I have a gripe with are 2 things. Some of the weapons have an unreasonably long wind-up and cooldown, and most of the sprites and or animations just look absurdly poor compared to the rest of the game's visuals. As many 3D objects as there are in this game, the weapons are just 2D sprites, and they have half as many frames of animations as everything else in the game. The sprites are blurry and choppy as anything in the game, and this is an aspect that had to progress from Doom and Quake 1. With the shifting of the weapons from the middle to the right side of the screen, you have to go so far as to model the player character's hands and how they interact with the weapon, and they just weren't able to pull off a very good look here all around. The blaster sprite honestly looks pretty okay, but the kickback when firing it is a little excessive, again, especially compensating for the number of frames, or lack thereof, that go into it. So the devs at least started off on a somewhat high note with the sprite work. Like I said before, the blaster's damage output is as non-existent as the axe in Quake 1, so you probably won't be seeing much of it. The shotgun fires pretty quickly, but it will also be used pretty rarely after the first level, in my opinion. And ironically, it probably has the worst look of all the weapon sprites. There are so few frames of animation when you rack it between shots, and I just can't justify it. But maybe at this point in Quake II's life, it was understood the shotgun was just meh and not used all that often. So why put maximum effort into something that wouldn't be at the forefront of the gameplay long term? The super shotgun, while it is the bread and butter of the combat in this game, has an unreasonably long wait time between shots. On the PC, Quake II Super Shotgun is one of the greatest shotguns in all of FPSdom. It gets nullified at times due to the spongy nature of the enemies, but it brought the heat. The N64 Super Shotgun wants to be one of the greatest shotguns in all of FPSdom, but the long reload time is just too much. The sprite isn't as noticeably subpar because it doesn't have too much detail to replicate from its original anyway. The submachine gun is where we get into the unreasonable windup. This thing takes almost an entire second from when you hit Z to when you see blood. And if you let off the trigger, you can add in another second for a cooldown before you can start the almost second long windup. Now that doesn't sound like a lot on paper, but in the heat of the moment, that's the difference between you getting put on a slab. The sprite looks pretty dull, but the muzzle flash looks nice. The chain gun is basically double everything. Double the damage, double the size, and double the wait times on both ends. If you let off the trigger too early, you are probably better off switching weapons than you are waiting for it to start firing again. The grenade launcher looks pretty good, but the kickback could have used another frame or two. Given the higher quantity of ammo you can find compared to the rocket launcher, it ends up being one of the most reliable weapons in the game, especially considering the likelihood it will stun your target. Next is the rocket launcher. Its wait time is hardly any longer than the super shotgun, and it of course packs a punch because it's a rocket launcher. It has the same perks as the grenade launcher, just with guaranteed access, but a bit more sparse ammo throughout the game. The railgun is a different color in this game for whatever reason. It looks nice, but suffers the same animation issues as the others. The railgun is useful against bigger enemies, but it fires slow enough that it can't be used as often as you might like with the high damage output. And of course, since we aren't playing with the mouse look, you can't expect it to be pull off the same long range quality of shots as the PC version. The Hyper Blaster is one of the worst sprites of them all. Even the muzzle flash is subpar. It's basically a high-powered chain gun and comes with the same give and take. A long wait time for it to fire, and a punishing wait if you let off the trigger too early. And last but not least is the BFG 10,000. I think the sprite is pretty cool, and how you have to hold it and then use the colored lighting on the player character is a nice touch. This one is to be used sparingly if you want to make use of the Hyper Blaster since they share the same ammo. And it isn't easy to come by. I really only recall ever using it during the boss battles except for level 17, but that doesn't mean there aren't good places to use it. But with ammo being so sparse, I was never really compared to use it anywhere else, except for maybe on some Icarus because I hate them so much. And then after writing all this, I thought about something else. A weapon wheel would have been a nice touch here. We had one in Quake II, and of course Quake III and Rage Wars, and Perfect Dark. There are so many weapons in Quake II, and it takes so long to cycle through them. You can't hit A or B, twice consecutively in the game cycle to that weapon like you get from GoldenEye and Perfect Dark. You have to push A, wait for the next weapon sprite to pop up, push it again, and it's just not great in a pinch whenever you're looking to get to a specific weapon. Overall, Quake II is a really good single-player experience as long as you have the expansion pack. Without it, don't bother because I think it could ruin the game for you. The team at Raster really went all out pushing the N64 to its limits and created mostly their own set of campaign levels to set the game apart from the PC original. There are plenty of environments and a few of the levels that consistently try to look very similar to the original, and it looks well enough and much improved over the visuals of Quake 64. And I'm not 100% sure, but I believe this is the same engine as Quake 64, just upgraded. Versus attempting to create yet another and losing time on technology like they had to with Quake 64, the team was able to focus on building the game they wanted versus building the technology to just make any game. If you are a fan of the original, then Quake II on the 64 can serve as a nice map pack, and I highly recommend at least trying to emulate it if you are able to set up your mouse look correctly. While it doesn't necessarily trump other N64 shooters in the gameplay department, it didn't have to, because it's not trying to be the same as GoldenEye. The term I would use to describe Quake II is bulky or chunky. The enemies are mostly big like Turok 2, and that lends itself to making it easier to land hits amid the slower performance at times in big firefights. And most of the weapons are either automatic or have a pretty sizable AoE. Sound design is as good as ever under Aubrey Hodges, but the ambient score is arguably his least noticeable out of the 4 console id games. It is really good when it's present, but so much of this game's memory is taken up by the impressive visuals and high variety of sound effects that I don't think the score was able to be given the same level of TLC as previous entries. This could be either Aubrey Hodges being strapped down with the overall sound design for the game, or it could be the memory limitations of the cartridges. Maybe it's both. But either way, he does a great job in all opportunities given. The theme for the main menu fit this game so well, so if there's any song that counts in a game, it could be the main menu for them to draw you in, and Hodges nailed it. As with most things in 2022, this costs a little more than I would like. So with it going for $20 to $25 now, I will tell you that it's a must-play, but maybe not a must-buy unless you're an N64 purist. The original is a whole $5 these days, so paying 4 to 5 times that for a somewhat objectively inferior, albeit interesting take on the same game, I can't justify to you. And yeah, you can emulate it as well for free if you want. In general, Quake II is a game that has somewhat flown under the radar over the years and is just known to exist somewhere in between Quake I and Doom 3. And that goes double for the N64 version. I'm sure Night Dive will have something to say about this in the next year or two, especially given what we saw at QuakeCon last week, and when that time comes, I sincerely hope the N64 version gets included in the same way Quake 64 got included as an add-on for the Quake remaster. Anyway, I hope you had as much fun as I did today, and if you haven't played this version of Quake II before, please go do so.